So for those who don't know, I'm actually the former plenary chair of the IoTSF, and there's probably enough faces in the room that are familiar with my face. So at this point I'm looking around the room and trying to work out now, was it because they knew I was coming on that it was time to go home, or was it regulation? Maybe don't answer that one. So a very brief piece about me. Zytex is my consulting company, provides guidance on cybersecurity for products and how to take them to market. My background, about 20 odd years in cybersecurity, firstly in the set-top box space, and then more recently, 15 years ago, doing femtocells, so very small cellular base stations that were connected on broadband. Long before that IoT stuff, that all came later. But for anybody who's knows much about the core network, obviously security is fairly key when you're connecting something on a broadband link into a mobile core network. So faced at least some of the things that I'm sure some of you have seen, been hacked, had to deal with it, had to negotiate with hackers, all that other good stuff. Anyway, enough about me. The Radio Equipment Directive. I appreciate for some people in the cyber world, what's that? But of course we're all familiar with wireless devices. But the Radio Equipment Directive originally came out in 2014. It is, by its very title, obviously it relates to anything to do with wireless devices for under the European legislation, and is a key part of CE marking for any wireless product. So the usual candidates apply. Got any of those, and pretty much any other wireless standard, then the Radio Equipment Directive suddenly now applies from a cyber security point of view. So I'll quickly give you a chance to have a look at that one. So hidden away in the Radio Equipment Directive back in 2014 was a clause 3.3, D, E, and F, and they were deprecated, which essentially meant they weren't part of the directive, they weren't enacted, and just over 2 years ago they were enabled. The EU viewed it as an efficient way of starting to get cybersecurity driven into the marketplace. So 3 key areas. The first one is part D is to protect the network. Part E is principally about privacy or anything to do with data that's not necessarily human, but has some degree of sensitivity. And then finally, part F is for financial devices that are handling financial data, financial transactions, etc. So as a result, CENELEC were tasked by the Commission and ENISA to produce 3 harmonized standards. For those who are not familiar, harmonized standard is one that applies across the whole of Europe, and then normally is referred to in the EU's official journal. So effectively those standards then become law, and as part of the compliance process, and normally those are the standards that would be put on a declaration of conformance for CE marking. So I won't go through the titles, they're dead exciting. Really just a quick recap here. The first part is very much focused on network assets. Second one, I say privacy, and they are quite discrete. So there's been an attempt to not have too much overlap. And just to be clear, it's not a case of, well, they don't, as it were, accelerate. So you would need, for example, if you were doing privacy, you've got a wireless device, you'd need to pass and be compliant with parts D and E, for example, not just be able to say, well, I'm compliant with part E. The thing to remember about the Radio Equipment Directive is it's a horizontal standard. It applies to any wireless product. So I shall sample through some of these just to give you a flavour. One exception, well, there's another one in a second, but except 5G. 5G, don't ask me all the rationale to that one. 5G, thought that was wireless. but it doesn't fall under, part of that actually for practical reasons is because the cellular space is very heavily standardised and there's an awful lot of standards material in the cellular space. All the usual types of things, toys, everything, industrial equipment. So it is very horizontal. The only other exception, again, because it's very heavily regulated, is medical equipment, unsurprisingly. So the things to keep in mind are, that's everything from modules, final product, all of them fall under the scope of the Radio Equipment Directive. The thing to keep in mind is, and we'll come on to this a little bit more in a second, the key thing to remember is things like security by design, some of the processes, vulnerability disclosure, they fall outside of the Radio Equipment Directive. And that's simply because the Radio Equipment Directive it's equipment focused. It's very much like traditional product conformance. You take a product, you test it, safety, ESD, immunity, but you don't look at the wider processes that go around that piece of compliance work. This one is no different. We'll touch on some of the things that are coming further on. There's obviously the presentation to come from the DCIT team on the PSTI, which of course for the UK will start to address things like vulnerability disclosure and some of the other obligations. So don't think it's not coming. The emphasis is very much on a common set of requirements. So I can imagine some people may look at it and go, well, does it need to be stricter? The emphasis is that it's horizontal. There will be further vertical standards that deal with particular sectors that need, for example, either specific or higher levels of security. So I'm not going to go through all of the standardisation requests. It's really just to give you a flavour of what was in M585, which was this is the request from the Commission to CENLEC to draft the harmonised standard. As I say, not meant to be an eye test, more just to give a flavour of the kinds of things. But there are quite a few things apart from the usual purely security cryptographic things. There are also things about usability and logins and on all of those other good things. In terms of the standard, I'm not going to try and do detail. Time won't permit. This is really, these couple of slides is just to give people a flavour of what's in the three parts. So you've got things like access control, authentication, secure update. I can't imagine any of these topics are surprises, etc., etc. So you can get a bit of a feel for what's in each of the parts. And then you've got some of the later ones, things like user notification, network monitoring, all of the kind of things that certainly I suspect in this room is taken as given, but I think certainly will cause in the market. I suspect this is going to start energising some product companies. That's again just a quick sample for those if you haven't seen the draft standard yet. Gives you a kind of flavour. So you've got a requirement, you've got a rationale, you've got a guidance. There's an assessment piece in terms of some of the requirements. So the thing to make clear is the standard looks quite a bit different from 303.645. Obviously, 303.645 was it's an excellent piece of work, and when it was originally written, obviously it wasn't intended as a harmonised standard. So you'll find fairly quickly that 303.645 is probably a little bit lighter reading than the harmonised standard, but obviously that's because some of the assessment processes, there's a lot more around how things might be assessed and some of the decisions that have to be made than are necessarily in the 303.645 standard. So this is, in terms of, again, a sample, just to give folks a feel, the decision-making process. So this is for assessment. So yeah, there are these kinds of decision trees you'll find in pretty much most of the requirements. They're intended to provide guidance for people who are needing to do compliance work, because don't forget, obviously in the same way as one would have done compliance in the past for radio products, a manufacturer can self-declare. So this isn't just written for example, test laboratories or accredited bodies. It is also intended for manufacturers to be able to self-declare. So the obvious one, timeline. Where are we today? So I think the other thing that's probably worth making the point on, normally harmonized standards are a 3 or a 4 year activity. Standards committee might meet once a month. Just to give you an idea, this standard is being attempted to be put together in 2 years. And for most of this year, certainly up until August, the standards committee was meeting, or the working group 8 of JTC 13 was meeting every week, which in the standards world is a bit unheard of. We are in the very closing stages of the inquiry phase. So what does that mean? So the draft of the standard has gone out to the various European standards organisations, of which BSI, for example, are the UK body, or one, AFNOR for France, BSI, confusingly, for Germany, NEN for Holland, etc. So the standard, the key date at the moment is, the plan is that the standard will be available at the end of Q2 2024. And I can imagine for those people who've been keeping an eye on this legislation, it's like, what do you mean? I've got a month from when I get the standard to finding that the standard is, the legislation is now applicable. Well, literally the decision, it's been formally announced, it was actually formally announced on the 27th of October, that the applicability date has been delayed until 1st of August 2025. I would still say, for a lot of organisations, that's still not going to give a lot of time. Jen Williams gave an excellent presentation in the Turing room. And again, if her experience, which certainly bears out mine, then there's going to be quite a few organisations that are going to be quite exercised by this. So the obvious question for those who've watched the Foundation for long enough, this conference is actually the 7th birthday of the Compliance Framework that was first published in its first release in December 2016. So the inevitable question being, so if I'd followed the Compliance Framework, where would I be today with respect to this standardisation activity? And I'm pleased to report, this is a very high-level piece of analysis. It's not in depth. It's literally tried to pull out some of the main pointers, some of the main clauses in the compliance framework. But if you take the various clauses in the standard, with the exception of logging, with the exception of logging, where there's possibly a little bit of a grey area, as you can see from the clause numbers on the right, the compliance framework pretty much covers you for all of the things in the standard. So the short answer is, if you've been following the compliance framework for the last few years, red shouldn't give you any major concerns. And obviously, as for those I'm sure who've probably already made use of it, it already covers things like NIST and 303.645. So with that, I'm going to open the floor to questions. So that's either shocked silence. John.
What are the implications of not adhering to that?
So in very simple terms, if you don't comply, it would mean in the same way that if your radio product was non-compliant for other reasons, immunity, ESD, then again, you don't have the right to either issue the declaration of conformance or the CE mark. But obviously that only applies from the 1st of August 2025. Gentleman behind.
How do you feel about the interaction between the Red DA and the cyber resilience
Great question. Great question. As Chris did exceedingly well with a rather wordy title, as you might have gathered by the title, I'm now involved with the standardisation request for the CRA. I think the best description is this work will probably form, as it were, the horizontal platform, if you will, for some of the forthcoming CRA. It's a very, very different animal. CRA at the moment is estimated to probably involve something like 30 standards, which is fairly terrifying. Of which, for example, 303.645 is seen to be possibly one of the candidates as a vertical for consumer. Inevitably, 62443 is also being seen as a potential vertical in the industrial space. So I would say very much an evolutionary approach, if you will. This is very much seen as being, as it were, that foundational piece. Working Group 9 is going through and reviewing and has been providing feedback back to on the standardisation request, and its role will be providing some of the horizontal work, which is because there's quite a lot of overlap between Working Group 8 Red and CRA Working Group 9. So that it'll be a mixture of a coordinating role in terms of coordinating then other bodies. So there'll be other Senelec committees, ETSI, there may well be some others who will start to deal with those vertical standards, whether there are specific standards for particular sectors. Hopefully that answers your question. Great. Anybody else? Okay, with that I will hand back to Chris. Thank you very much.